All right, welcome everybody. My name is Bodong Chen. I'm a co-director of the Learning Informatics Lab at CEHD. I just want to give you a warm welcome to you for attending our second Learning Informatics webinar this academic year. And this time we're featuring Professor Marcelo Worsley from Northwestern University. I just want to start this event by saying a few words about the lab. The Learning Informatics Lab was established last year as an interdisciplinary intellectual space where we research the design and also mobilize information technology in all kinds of settings to improve learning. It could be K-12 classroom or higher education online learning spaces. We want to build relationship with different units and different faculties across our campuses and also beyond, like industry partners. We also want to identify shared problems that we can work together to solve, which will have impact in education. So I will post some information about the lab in the chat, and you can find more about it. And then feel free to get in touch if you have a shared interest with us. With that, I want to hand this over to David to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Bodong. I'm David de Lima. I am an assistant professor in Psych Foundations, and we are really beyond excited to welcome Dr. Marcelo Worsley to our Learning Informatics Lab speaker series. Dr. Worsley is an assistant professor at Northwestern University with a joint appointment in computer science and education and social policy. He runs the TILT lab, which you will see on the beanie that he is wearing at Northwestern, which stands for Technological Innovations for Inclusive Learning and Teaching. And I'll just note the lab's statement on inclusivity, which focuses on, quote, addressing historic and contemporary disparities in inclusivity and social, racial, and economic inequity. Toward this end, Dr. Worsley has been a core driver of the field of multimodal learning analytics. And on a personal note, as someone who studies and cares about gesture, body movement, eye gaze, and material interactions as they unfold in learning situations, my thinking on these topics has been deeply informed by Dr. Worsley's multimodal approach to analytics. I'll also note that Dr. Worsley has been organizing workshops around how to cross methodological divides between qualitative and quantitative approaches to multimodal education research, and that too has provided an immense contribution to the field. So thank you again, Dr. Worsley, for joining us. The Learning Informatics Lab is glad to have you. And let me now hand the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Bodong and David. So I tweaked the title a little bit. So now I'm saying it's Multimodal Learning Analytics Core Commitment for Intentionally Centering Inclusivity in Data Science. I originally put the talk together and was thinking just broadly about what are these commitments. But today I kind of want to emphasize the ways that we really want to center inclusivity within like the core of the work that we're doing with data. And so to those ends, I'm going to talk through some of my work around multimodal learning analytics. Before I do so though, let me just, I want to recognize the various PhD students on the left-hand side and a handful of the undergraduate students on the right-hand side who have contributed to my lab. And these are people who I'm in regular conversation with and who do a lot of work to build out the different tools, resources that end up contributing to that research. I also want to recognize a number of thought partners and collaborators. You'll see your very own David de Lima here. So four of these people, David, Ben Shapiro, Cynthia D'Angelo, and Ananda Marin, were participants within a multimodal learning analytics for interaction analysis workshop that I did last year, maybe. Sorry, the time has sort of slips away. And we've continued these conversations, and just the opportunity to be in sort of regular discussion with these four in particular has really been great and has contributed a lot to my thinking. And it's actually one of the things that sort of pushed me in thinking about and really trying to identify a set of core commitments for multimodal learning and analytics. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you're seeing Roberto Martinez Maldonado, who is a researcher at, goodness, he used to be at University of Technology, Sydney. He is now at, the name slips my mind. I will find the name for you because I forgot where it is, but he is in Australia. And he's just been another great person to interact with as, someone who's interested in multimodal learning analytics and also interested in HCI. All right, so with that, here's the outline. Gonna go ahead and sort of suggest a handful of takeaways so that one, I don't forget, and two, to make sure that we actually get there. And then I'm gonna kind of start to jump into multimodal learning analytics, talking a little bit about what it is, but functionally, what I really want to do today is spend less time talking about the what of multimodal learning analytics. And if people want to get more detail about the what of multimodal learning analytics, I'm happy to share. There's a couple of webinars that I've done beforehand. One of them was run by Circle, and have also done some at like Learning Analytics Summer Institute. And I really want to jump more into the core commitments. Some of the questions around why and questions around how. Because I think those are oftentimes things that end up getting overlooked, but things that actually play a huge part in the ways that the research is conducted. And so then after that, I'll jump back to those takeaways and then move into questions. So takeaways, we'll go ahead and jump right to them. First thing I want to say is grad students, you can spur change. Most of the work, and a lot of the work that I did on multimodal learning analytics took place while I was a graduate student. A lot of these ideas came into formation in Paul Blickstein's lab at that time out at Stanford. And those ideas ended up turning into something named. And I'm be very clear to say, I don't feel like multimodal learning is something that is invented. I feel like it's something that's kind of been named and formalized. But it is something that Paul and I were able to name and formalize and sort of subsequently allow that to grow. But part of what I am going to talk about today is, how that came to be and how that kind of growth took place, and really to encourage the fact that, grad students, you all can spur change. And I know it's sometimes in grad school, you miss that part. You feel like you're just here to always learn from your faculty members. And you are here to learn from your faculty members. I want to be clear about that. But you're also here to be learning partners, and you're also here to bring in and support and push forth new ideas and push faculty members in their thinking. Again, too, data can speak volumes. You guys, I think, are a part of a generation and really a part of an organization that recognizes the different ways that data can have an impact. And I say that data can have an impact for good or for bad. And that's part of what I want to get into today is our choices around the kinds of data that we collect, how we collect that data, how we represent that data, and then subsequently how we disseminate that data. That ends up speaking volumes. It speaks volumes not just about the kinds of theories that we are investigating. It also speaks volumes about our positionality, our perspective, and our view on the world. And so just, that's part of the reason I put this in here is to say that, yes, data is important for trying to conduct research, but the ways that we collect our data also speaks volumes about the researcher, about the person who is actually conducting that work. And that's something that I want to make sure that people don't forget. So along that lines, as you're going through this work, be intentional. As you're working with data, as you're working with data science, as you're working with analytics, don't try to argue that the work is neutral. I think I will say the work of multimodal learning analytics is not neutral. But also make sure that the intentionality is not lost, right? And I'm actually going to get to this in the next few slides and kind of talk through this some. But to really recognize that data science is not something that is neutral. Data science is something that we can harness as a weapon for good or harness as a weapon for bad. And the reality is that people are doing both. I can even say within multimodal learning analytics, I feel like it is being marshaled for good and for bad. And so to recognize that, again, our decisions aren't neutral. Our decisions are pushing things. And so I just want to definitely press them. That's one of the takeaways. And then lastly, realize that intentionality across the research, the various parts of a research project. You know, we can think, well, okay, I'm trying to answer this specific research question, which takes me into a certain community. And because that's what I'm doing, that sort of satisfies the goals around intentionality. But it actually goes beyond that. It goes beyond that in terms of how you collect your data, how much ownership you give participants over their data, how you end up representing and talking about participants based on that data, and then subsequently how you share that data. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today as I talk through some of these core commitments. First, I'll just say, you know, at a high level, for people who have not heard of multimodal learning analytics, a paper that Paul and I wrote back in 2011 says learning analytics is a set of multimodal sensory inputs that can be used to predict, understand, and quantify student learning. This was kind of a very early on instantiation of this. In our view, learning analytics did not need to have this qualifier multimodal in front of it, because the idea was already like learning is inherently multimodal. So there's no need to, like, putting multimodal in front of it was somewhat redundant. But there was a lot of work happening in learning analytics that was purely web-based or purely digital. So the multimodal term kind of got thrown in there to add that emphasis. Now, to give you an idea of some of the modalities people are working with, I did a literature review a few years ago looking at the sort of most common modalities that are coming up in research. And the biggest ones are really video and audio, and then gesture and eye tracking. All of those you're getting pretty regular use within the different publications that are coming out in multimodal learning analytics. But then you're also having these other modalities. So skin conductance, or also sometimes referred to as galvanic skin response, using digital pins and then using things like GPS and Bluetooth. So these are kind of like the big hitters in sort of multimodal learning analytics. When you actually look across the years at the different modalities, you see something that's a little bit more complex and even some more nuanced. You know, the big picture thing to see here is, I'll say, back in 2012, when a lot of this work was just getting started, you're really only looking at a handful of different modes. But subsequently, as you can visually see looking down the line here, things become increasingly complex in terms of the different modalities people are looking at. So I'm mentioning this mostly just to give you a sense of the types of modalities, the types of data that people might be using in multimodal learning analytics research, and just to kind of give you an overview of even how things have changed and progressed over time. And some of that is in recognition too of the fact that the term multimodal is not necessarily something that is sort of universally understood across different spaces. All right. So I'm going to jump to a slightly different definition or different quotation of multimodal learning analytics, where it says MLA sits at the intersection of three ideas: multimodal teaching and learning, multimodal data, and computer supported analysis. At its essence, MMLA utilizes and triangulates among non-traditional as well as traditional forms of data in order to characterize or model student learning in complex learning environments. However, as you described later, the ways researchers utilize multimodal data vary widely. So compared to what I'd put up there beforehand in multimodal learning analytics, around what it is, the quotation that came from the paper and Paul and I wrote, this starts to get a little bit more of the nuance and a little bit more of the intention of multimodal learning analytics as we designed it. And some that had to do with identifying learning in these non-traditional modes, as well as learning in these non-traditional learning spaces, these sort of complex learning environments. But to date, we haven't really articulated terribly strongly or terribly clearly, I'd say, a set of commitments that really speak to the overall motivation of this work. And so that's what I'm going to get to. As a bit of history, people who know me and know Paolo Blickstein, my advisor, a lot of the work that we did took place in makerspaces. with students doing hands-on projects. And this was back in 2009, 2010, where a lot of the work that was happening within learning analytics was taking place within intelligent tutoring systems, online sort of cognitive tutoring systems. And part of, I think I'd say some of our frustration, or maybe some of what we wanted, was we wanted to be able to take some of those techniques, take some of those ideas, and take some of the excitement that was happening in terms of educational data mining and learning analytics, and be able to apply that within a more hands-on setting, in part because people have oftentimes looked at these hands-on learning environments and said, what learning is taking place here? Students are having fun. They're not really learning. So one of the goals was to say, look, learning is taking place within these spaces. Really consequential, really important learning is taking place. So perhaps by using multimodal data, which is the kind of data that we would already be using, so thinking about video data, audio data, looking at interactions that are happening between students and materials, and interactions that are happening between student and student, those are the kind of things that we would already be looking at to analyze this kind of data as humans. And so we kind of said, well, what would happen if we were to develop some algorithms or develop approaches that would allow for machines to start to help us analyze this data? And sort of from that, this idea of multimodal learning analytics kind of came about. And you're even seeing, so in this bottom left-hand corner, you would see we'd set up these little cameras. And again, this is the kind of things that many researchers already do in a research context, right? When you have students working in groups. We set these up really with the goal of being able to analyze them using tools of computer vision and sort of like speech recognition and that sort of thing. So this was a large part of the context that the multimodal learning analytics work came out of. All right, and so with that, there's really this idea that MLA was not neutral. It was really intentionally set up to say, how do we do a better job of demonstrating the learning that is taking place, recognizing learning that's taking place, or characterizing the learning that is taking place within these non-traditional learning environments? And for me, a lot of it was terribly personal because I had spent the past several years doing after-school programming at a Boys and Girls Club. And for many of the students, they got the sense from parents as well as from teachers in schools that those experiences that they were having in after-school clubs where they were designing and building things were not valuable. They weren't elevated to the same level of importance as the textbook learning that students were doing in school. So really what we wanted with multimodal learning analytics is to be able to have approaches that would help push on that perspective that what's happening in that hands-on context was not meaningful. All right, so with that, I'm going to actually get into the set of commitments, and the way I've actually broken down these different commitments are in 3 different areas. And thinking about data collection, thinking about how we analyze the data, and then thinking about feedback. How do we take our analyses and actually share those out and do something with them? I may not be able to get through all of these different components, so I'll be keeping track of time as I kind of go through them. But broadly speaking, there's a lot of considerations that come into play when trying to design a study. And I think part of what I'm trying to get across in thinking about these commitments are the ways that different commitments related to multimodal learning analytics can actually play out across these sections of collecting data, analyzing it, and disseminating. So all right, core commitments. First section, data collection. So here is really a commitment around multimodality. And so the quotation says, a key tenet of MLA is the recognition that teaching and learning are enacted through multiple modalities. Even in a traditional classroom, teachers engage in significant multimodal behaviors, voice inflections, gestures, etc., in order to emphasize and de-emphasize different ideas of a lecture. Similarly, students draw upon a host of modalities in order to demonstrate their knowledge and, more importantly, to gain in their understanding of a given subject area. In this way, MLA draws upon certain ideas from constructionism, namely the importance of conceptualizing and constructing using a broad set of modalities and embodied cognition, the ability or embodied experiences to spur cognition. So in thinking about multimodality, it was not just about, hey, let's come up with better measures. It's also really about saying, look, teaching and learning already happen in ways that are highly multimodal. And it is going to be important for us as researchers to provide ways for students to really demonstrate knowledge in whatever way they want to, in whatever way comes natural to them, and in whatever way is meaningful to them. It is not our position to try to dictate or say that students, in order for students to effectively demonstrate their competencies or their knowledge, they have to do it using a certain mode. And so really one of the core commitments of multimodal learning analytics is just that. It is just saying that the use of this data is in recognition of the plurality of ways that students may demonstrate or communicate knowledge, interest, and intent. And when we take away that plurality of ways that students are able to do that, we end up restricting certain students from being able to be recognized as intelligent. And really it ends up dishonoring really the different cultural backgrounds that people might bring, the different linguistic backgrounds that people might bring. And that's something that we want to be intentional about, and that we definitely want to avoid. We want to make sure that the spaces and the analytics and the data analysis processes that we're setting up are set up in such a way that they do recognize that plurality and do not just continue to marginalize groups that have already been marginalized. Second commitment, and this is really around expansive learning experiences, which I think I've mentioned some earlier, is that the goal of MLA is to support learning experiences that may be collaborative, hands-on, and face-to-face, de-emphasizing the computer screen as the primary form or object of interaction. You know, after you all saw the slide where you have the students sitting in the makerspace and working together, doing hands-on activities and doing things, again, collaboratively, you probably get the sense then that, yeah, this it really is about moving away from a very traditional form of schooling, a very traditional form of learning, and instead tries to say, well, let's find ways to really encourage and support the kind of learning that takes place within these hands-on collaborative learning environments. And I mean, I think the second part of this is also super important, is that we're trying to de-emphasize, one second, I've got kids coming up. The second part of this is super interesting too, right? It's not that we're trying to do away with computers. It's more so that we want to help people recognize that computers come in many different forms and factors nowadays, right? We've got computers that, I don't actually have my phone with me, it's somewhere around here. Computers exist within our phones. Computers exist within the sort of smart speakers. Computers exist in so many different forms that we want to move away and sort of de-emphasize the fact that computers, or really make sure that people are aware of the fact computers don't have to involve a traditional screen, and the interaction does not have to be a person sitting in front of a screen. And so that's one of the other key points that we're trying to emphasize with multimodal learning analytics. The next one is the idea is that a goal of MLA is to help make the invisible visible. This is in terms of invisible modalities, and more broadly in terms of patterns or practices that may exist within the data but may remain hard to see without computational aid. So I've actually taken a picture from some of Bertrand Schneider's work on using eye tracking, and that's sort of like what you're seeing with like the green dot here and these different fiducial markers that he has set up, where one of the ideas within multimodal learning analytics is that there are certain modalities that we can actually do a good job of let's say even some better job of capturing when we use different sorts of wearables or using different sorts of data mining techniques. So here you're seeing some eye tracking data points here and also down here at the bottom. But sort of eye tracking data is an example of something that would be hard for us as humans to sit and look at and to easily be able to know exactly where someone is looking. There's ways we can oftentimes approximate, but using something like eye tracking, you're able to get a much more fine-grained picture of that. At the same time, though, part of the idea within multimodal learning analytics is not just that you're going to use fully automated processes. At times, something that you might end up doing is using machine learning on data that's been qualitatively coded, to kind of help you see patterns that might be that might exist or might be emerging over these longer time periods. So this is again one of the other commitments, is to kind of make the invisible visible. Now there's some challenges with this too, and we're going to actually get into some of that when we think about some of the commitments around how to analyze that data. And one of them is that when you're looking at data that is seemingly invisible, or things that really completely rely on the computer, seemingly rely on just the computer, the algorithms for interpretation, you do run into challenges of a bias and misinterpreting the data that's present. And so one of the later commitments around actually engaging participants in the interpretation and the analysis of their own data is going to become important for that. Next one is looking at participants across spaces can give a richer picture of how the student experiences a given space and how their knowledge and ideas may be influenced by and evidence across contexts. I think this is one that is becoming increasingly, ever increasingly important as we think about the larger learning ecosystems that students are participating in. So one of the goals within the commitment with multimodal learning analytics is to say that students are practicing learning across a lot of different contexts. We want to be able to recognize that learning that's taking place across those different contexts, because we know that is what's happening. And so yeah, just again, that ends up being one of those commitments. I think this might be the last one for data collection, but is that research participants should control their data and when data collection devices are active. And this is one that I think can be particularly challenging for research, because researchers often feel like we're the ones that should own the data. When in reality, I think one of the commitments that MLA is trying to push towards is, well, let's actually let participants be the ones who are controlling their data and the ones who are actually deciding when this audio collection device is on and when it's turned off. Doing so helps us to start to shift power that oftentimes, comes with being the researcher, and shift some of that power more to the side of the participants. And I think that's an important part of our job as researchers. All right, now on to data analysis and inference. So the first one in thinking about data analysis and inference is this importance of normalizing data. And the ways that we kind of normalize and deal with individual differences is something that is super, super important. We know in terms of even like the way that different people express the same facial expression, those end up can vary quite a bit. And so one of the things that researchers need to do is make sure that they're doing a good job of actually normalizing and really recognizing the uniqueness of different people and the uniqueness of different groups. One of the examples I oftentimes give is using gesture tracking, or looking at skeletal body tracking. That if the way that you were to look at that data is to primarily look at like the actual distance someone is moving, maybe moving a limb or something like that, you end up introducing a huge bias based on the size of someone's body. But when you end up instead accounting for the angle over which their body part moves, you can actually take out that contribution that body sides provide. So there's important things that that you need to think about in terms of how you are normalizing your data and accounting for the differences between individuals. So this is actually a huge a really, really important issue in my view. And that's this idea that the features that may emerge from a given algorithm very seldom provide a direct or singular connection to learning constructs. Instead, making sense of these features will often require human inference, knowledge of the algorithms used, and deep awareness of the context. And I'm going to go to the next slide because it actually shows a representation of this. This is a slide I used in many talks. As education researchers, or as people who are really studying human behavior, we oftentimes think in terms of learning constructs. We want to be able to study somebody's conceptual change, their mindset, their identity. In my view, and really what I'm suggesting as a commitment within multimodal learning analytics, is the idea that what an algorithm is going to give us is not a learning construct. It may be a feature, it may be an indicator, but it is not a learning construct. And it's important for us to recognize that separation, because otherwise you might even go to something like a facial expression and say, well, the algorithm gave me the facial expression that this person was angry or this person was mad. But that is not necessarily what the person was actually experiencing. So there's an important point about looking at the difference between the features that are coming out and then the kinds of constructs or even the type of inferences that we're making based on those behaviors or based on those features. So that's one that I really want to underscore, this separation between the learning constructs that we might be looking at and the actual features that might end up emerging. And just to kind of give you a rundown of this graphic, really what we're looking at is from a given data capture device, you may get certain types of data. That data needs to be typically analyzed using some analytic tool. And then within that analytic tool, you'll maybe have one or more analytic techniques. And then those analytic techniques subsequently spit out a set of features. And once you kind of have those features and you end up working interpreting those features, making sense of them, then you might be able to get back to a learning construct. But just to make sure that we're not stopping at the indicator and saying that the indicator is the actual learning construct. Another one that I think is actually hugely important is that learners are not defined by the behaviors that they exhibit within a given context. Any quote unquote predicted label or dependent variable that is used within an algorithm or generated by data analysis reflects an interpretation of what a participant did, not who they are. One thing I feel like I've observed in a number of papers is language that will talk about, for example, students who scored low on an assessment as low achievers, or students who scored high on an assessment as high achievers. Part of the commitment that I'm trying to put forth here is that that kind of a label is not correct. It's not just, it's not accurate, and it is something that I think we want to avoid. We can say that a student scored lower on an examination, but to then subsequently try to label that student as a lower achiever, I think that goes against what I think that is basically ascribing a certain quality to a person, and which is not what I think we should be doing. I think we can talk about what they did or what their performance was, but that is different from their identity. That is different from who they are. And I'll say that on the most surface level, just to say, because of context, because of what happens in different contexts, we can say it is inaccurate to say that someone is a low achiever or not. And so I'll leave it at that. But this is another one that I think is hugely important, that also ends up translating into, again, the way that we talk about participants within our research and in the ways that we end up writing about them. Related to a point I made earlier, I think it's important to give participants the opportunity to contribute to the research and understanding of data. This can be an important way to provide transparency and improve the validity of claims that emerge from an analysis. This links back to what I mentioned earlier about making the invisible visible. In order to make the invisible visible, it really should be coupled with this type of opportunity for the participants to be able to contribute to the researcher's understanding. Next one is kind of around multimodal fusion. So exercising intentionality in multimodal fusion really helps to produce better outcomes. And there's another slide here that's going to kind of demonstrate this better. So when you think about, for example, this idea of engagement, which is something we oftentimes talk about within education research, you can think about instantiating or studying engagement in a few different ways. And I've sort of represented two of these ways here. So let's say what you're really trying to do when you come into a classroom or into a learning space is you're just trying to see, are the students engaged? What you might be looking for is any semblance of verbal interaction in the form of speech, any amount of gesticulations or gesture movement to say that they're sort of engaged in the activity, or even biosensory data that might let you key you into high levels of cognitive load or something like that, right? The idea is that you're looking just for the presence of engagement, and that can be represented by high amounts of data, high amounts of signal along any of these three different modalities. On the other hand, though, you might be more interested in studying, well, what is the type of engagement, where engagement is not really tied to a single modality, but instead is a combination of real-time interactions between or among the audio data, gesturing, and biosensor data. And I oftentimes refer to epistemological frames work done by Sharon Hammer, where they talk about the different types of engagement that students might exist within a classroom. And so they'll talk about a sort of a worksheet frame where a student is heads down, not really talking, and maybe doing some writing. A more of a discussion frame where the student's body position is up and they're looking at their peers and they're engaging in conversation with one another. The teaching assistant frame where the students are not really talking much, they're not gesticulating much, but their head attention is sort of pointed upwards toward an instructor. So I just say that when we're thinking about fusing multimodal data, these are some of the considerations that you have to take, you have to think through. Is what is it that I'm trying to look for? Am I just looking for the presence of this engagement, or am I looking for certain types of engagement? And being intentional about that multimodal data fusion is something that really gives you the space to actually start to answer the questions that you might want to answer. Next is really this idea of when analyzing data, to think about not just individuals, but also think about multiple participants, and thinking about the fact that the interactions that take place have a big impact on what you subsequently see in terms of students learning or how students are responding. So when we analyze individual data within a group setting, we sort of discount the fact that this person was interacting with other people. Or this person was interacting with other materials. And so it's important to try to represent that also. And then I think this is also the last one. This section is thinking across different levels of abstraction and trying to get a sense of at what level, for example, what's the time scale over which I expect to see some sort of change, or what's the time scale over which I'm interested in looking. When we are just focusing on the microscopic, we might be then missing out on the longer term, or really looking at things over which you're much less likely to have significant change over a given time. So one of the other commitments is really about reconciling or thinking through how someone's learning, how someone's knowledge development might be instantiated across different timescales. Okay, sorry, there's another one too. Think about the actual representations, and I kind of touched on this some before, but the actual representations can play a big role in how we interpret data. So what you're seeing here is some work by Bertrand Snyder and Paulo Blickstein, where they'd analyzed skeletal tracking data. And when they just looked at the numbers that corresponded to each of these different charts, they didn't really see much. It didn't really make much sense. But when they actually took that data and represented it in three-dimensional form, they could actually start to see different body poses. So just to say that we really want to be intentional about the representations that we're using. All right, and lastly, thinking about feedback and dissemination. One, and I'll say that I think within the area of multimodal learning analytics, feedback and dissemination are areas that have gotten less attention. And one of the hopes is that feedback and dissemination is going to get more attention moving forward. So the first thought in terms of feedback and dissemination is that multimodal research projects should provide transparency and meaningful benefits to participants as quickly as possible. And this is something I feel like really should translate into all forms of research, in that we want to make sure that our approaches, our analyses, our ways of thinking and doing are made transparent to participants within the research. But it's also about helping the participants actually get some sort of benefit from the work that we do. So on the left-hand side, you're seeing work from Dora Abramson's MIT system, and so there it's actually using the multimodal data from a Kinect sensor to really help a student reason through and think about ratios and think about ratios and fractions. So it's an example where the actual multimodal data is something that, well, in this case, Dora and his team are using to study the learning experience, but it's also building on the fact that using this multimodal data and using the multimodal representation, or in this case, so it's a sort of graphical representation of the student's action, actually provides something beneficial to the user. On the right-hand side is a platform that one of my students developed called TangiCraft, where we're using fiducial markers and wooden blocks to allow people who have a visual impairment to play the game Minecraft. So again, it's really about saying, look, we actually want to take our insights and our knowledge about multimodal interaction and actually use that in a way that is going to be productive and provide meaningful benefit to users. Next one is this idea of providing multimodal feedback. So, we oftentimes, we think about the importance of multimodality as an input, but multimodality can also be important as an output. So here is just a sort of a diagram from proprioceptive action, where a device is actually creating a muscular response within someone. And so one of the things that I think could be interesting moving forward and sort of thinking about the future is opportunities where researchers, as they're interacting with someone's multimodal data, they're actually getting that multimodal data in terms of multimodal feedback, for one, as well as opportunities for us to better leverage multimodal output to give users feedback about how they're performing or interacting with any given space. So over the past couple of years, I've been working on a project to study collaboration. And within that, we've been thinking about, well, how do we provide useful information back to an individual participant about how they're participating or how they're collaborating. Traditionally, people would just put that information on a graph or put that information on a chart. But the reality is, with the introduction of things like smartwatches and other wearables, we have other modalities through which to communicate this kind of content or communicate information to users. So one of the other commitments of multimodal learning analytics is really to think about those different kinds of modalities. And I'll say some of this too is also in recognition of accessibility, to say, look, if we're going to recognize the plurality of ways that people are able to demonstrate their knowledge, we also need to recognize the plurality of ways that we want people to be able to make sense of the information that we are trying to share with them through our different data mining approaches. And then lastly, end user MLA interfaces should deliver meaningful education information that non-data savvy users can understand. So this is actually a visualization of that collaboration platform that I've been working on. We're trying to really provide simple user interfaces, but it's not even just simple user interfaces. It's also about saying, what is the kind of information that students in this case, actually want to get to improve their performance, or to improve the way that they're collaborating. We oftentimes start things off with research questions and want to be able to answer information for the researcher and to build theory around research. And those are important things to do, but I think it's also important for us to take into consideration what is the kind of information that end users would actually want to get out of our multimodal learning analytics work, such that it can contribute to their experience. All right, so just get back to these takeaways. Grad students, you guys can spur change. Data can speak volumes. Data can speak volumes about the given learning context, but also can speak volumes about the researcher and their how they're being intentional or not intentional in the ways that they are approaching research communities and analyzing the data and disseminating that information. To really push you to kind of be intentional. Don't sort of feign this idea of neutrality. In many senses, by not being intentional about the goals or the objectives, you're essentially allowing the status quo to continue, and that in of itself is not neutrality. And then lastly, sort of realizing the intentionality across the different research project elements. And so that's the idea of thinking about how do we make sure that the approaches that we're taking are inclusive, and that's thinking about that from the perspective of data collection, from the perspective of data analysis and data dissemination. And with that, it looks like I should stop now. Thank you guys, and open it up for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. If you have a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A space. You can also drop it in the Zoom chat, or raise your hand, and Bodong and I can actually turn on your mic, or allow you to turn on your mic so that you can ask Marcelo a question. While you're getting situated and thinking about a question, I'll kick it off with a quick thought. Marcelo, you made a really, you made so many great points, and you'll see in the chat, a lot of us were tracking some of our reactions. One of the points that you made is that the analysis of multimodal data needs to be coupled with an understanding of the epistemic frame or the activity frame that is shaping the interaction. You noted if the activity is about looking down at a paper, your sensor data is going to look very different, and you don't want to analyze that data without that understanding. Is there a tension between getting the participants quick feedback on the sensor data that you're collecting and analyzing it, versus taking a slower approach and having a human researcher make sense of what the activity frame is and what the epistemic frame is before the data goes back to the participants?
Yeah, I mean, I think there can be value in both of those. Partially, as you sort of described it, there's ways that I think the researchers are able to distill information into something that can be usable, or that the participant can make sense of, right? The idea is not necessarily we're just gonna, all right, we have all this data, now we're gonna show it to the participant. I think there definitely is a responsibility to make sure that that data is set up in a way that is that can be useful for your user. And part of that too, I think it also is about recognizing what is actually useful for your user. I think in many cases, we do research to promote our research, and not necessarily do research to also think about what the participants would actually benefit from in that shorter term. And so I think part of what I'm suggesting is that, yes, we need to do research. We should continue to do research. But as we're doing research, think about the ways that our research can, along the way, support those participants. And I guess it's also twofold. I mean, I think when we start to think about trying to help participants make sense of the data, we also even probably set up a better space for just the communities at large to be able to make sense of that data. So yeah, I'd say definitely I would not advocate for, okay, we just got this big pile of data, here's the data, make sense of it. I think there definitely does need to be some work done to make sure that that data has kind of been distilled down to something that is that users can track. So yeah, I think there definitely is a balance that needs to happen there.
All right, thanks a lot. And I see a question in the Q&A space, which is basically, it's coming from, I think, one of our alumnus of our college, Dr. Ersin, asking more or less a general question. Are you more excited about the possibilities of multimodal learning analytics, or its challenges or biases? And maybe you can generally comment on your you know, reaction to this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still excited about the possibilities. For the ways that I've been trying to think more about multimodal learning analytics, a lot of it has been thinking about, well, let's actually develop new kinds of interfaces that, for example, allow people with disabilities to be able to interact with technologies. And I mean, it's in some sense, it's funny. It's like when I started off in grad school, some of my interest was around just developing these multimodal inputs. But the reality was you needed to have some analytics sitting behind those multimodal inputs to actually reasonably use those things within the technology. That said, though, it's hard because at times I will be at a given event and I will actually have people from companies come and talk to me and say, "Oh, hey, we want to use your technology to be able to predict which of these sixth grade students is going to be most likely to go to college in STEM." And it's things like that that I find absolutely terrifying. The idea that we want to sort of decide which of these kids we want to support and which ones we don't want to support based on a relatively small amount of data at a very early age, that's the kind of thing that I'm sort of concerned about. That's the kind of thing that I'm kind of like, okay, we don't want to go down that route. But at the same time, I think there are some neat things that we can do with multimodal learning analytics. And actually, there's one more thing that I didn't actually explicitly put this in there, and that is this idea that multimodal learning analytics that takes place in research labs, to me, is substantively different than the multimodal learning analytics that takes place in schools. One of the ideas is that some people I think have thought about, for me, the grand vision is to take all the stuff that I've used in the lab and plop that down into as many schools as I possibly can. That's absolutely not what I want to do. I think there's things we want to be able to learn from the laboratory context. I think there's selection of those things we may want to integrate into school, but oftentimes what we're trying to do within the laboratory setting is more so understand a theory or more so understand a type of intervention that we can develop or a type of tool that we can develop that is not going to be set up to just constantly leach students' data, even data that we don't know what or how to make sense of it. So that's one thing I forgot to mention on one of those slides, that what multimodal learning analytics in a lab context I see is hugely different from what takes place within a school context. And in my view, in the school context, less is more. Being able to use fewer sensors, being able to use less complexity, so to speak, that actually has a lot more mileage, and that actually can provide a lot more than I think these approaches of we're just going to wire up every school with all the symptoms that we can.
Thanks a lot. And I saw Pani had the hands up. Pani, can you hear us? Do you still have a question?
Yes. Thank you, Marcelo. This was a great presentation. I think you answered to some extent my question, but I will still ask it and see if you have anything more to add. I was wondering, the way you see multimodal analytics and the way you approach the questions that you pursue, do you see it more as a way to approach, evaluate, and capture complexity? Or does it also work in terms of complicating simplicity?
I'd say yes. I think it does both. I think there's times where I've tried to use multimodal learning analytics to do things like, maybe somebody has this argument that students who, I don't know, walk faster do better in school, right? And that, of course, that was completely made up. But sometimes what you really want to do is be able to tease apart what is actually happening within a given learning intervention, and really break that down into its complex pieces. Break that down so you can actually really like peel away the different pieces of the onion, so to speak, and really get like a super rich, super rich picture of what's going on. But I think at other times, I think it can go the other way. Can go the direction of people have this sort of very complex way of looking at something, or it's very complex space, and part of what you are trying to do is distill it down to something simple. So I think, I think it definitely can go both ways. I will say, in thinking about a lot of my work, though, I think it really has been more of trying to pull out some of the complexities of different learning interventions, and trying to make sense of, okay, what actually seems to matter about this given learning intervention, at least as it's been practiced by these teachers or practiced by these students within this context. And I guess that's the parts where, you end up adding these different layers of complexity when we're thinking about the different forms of data that you have.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Do we have any other, if you have a question, please feel welcome to raise your hand, or drop a note in the Q&A. I'm going to highlight a point that came up in the chat, and it is about the mapping between learning constructs and indicators. You noted, you expressed caution, right, that we should really think carefully about that mapping, and it's not a simple, this is what the sensor says, this is the construct it maps to. But that begs the question, are there good mappings that we know of in the field? How does a researcher thoughtfully approach straddling that gap in a project?
I'm very, I guess I'm probably traditional in that sense, in that it's like, great, you get these features out, get to know your data. In my view, and this is what I've traditionally done with my research, is alongside doing a multimodal learning analytics like approach on it, I will actually go and watch and like manually code, content log, what have you, the video data that goes with it, so that I can actually start to interrogate, like, is this feature something that seems to actually be salient? What does it actually seem to be connected to in terms of a variety of learning constructs that I might care about? So I really think trying to go and interrogate your data is super important. I think the other part of it, though, is kind of being in collaboration and conversation with other people, to see how they go about interpreting it. They go about explaining or drawing insight from that data. And this too, I think, is where also engaging with participants can be something else that can be useful. So David, even to your question earlier, one of the things you can think about is to be able to, what kind of data would you actually show participants? Maybe it is the feature output, and let them sort of reason through that part. And the common example I give, I feel like I give or constantly comes up, is the example of facial expressions, right? You'll oftentimes have a computer algorithm tell you, well, this person is expressing neutrality, this person is expressing frustration, this person is expressing anger. But as we know, facial expressions are not the same thing as affect, as what somebody is experiencing. And so we can engage them in conversation about that piece. But that also points to the idea of actually interrogating that data yourself, right? You might see somebody expressing frustration, but the frustration is actually out of, I don't know, joy or something like that. Or rather, you might see what looks like a facial expression of joy or a frustration, but that actually is coming out of joy. Or maybe it's coming because the person is struggling to understand a question, and it's maybe it's some sort of productive frustration kind of thing. So I think those are some of the different contextual elements that you want to be able to think through as you are analyzing and making sense of the data that you have.
Wonderful. Right now we're 1 minute past 4 o'clock, and I think there might be some other questions, and but we'll make sure this video get posted. And this is such a treat for this group. And thanks a lot, Dr. Worsley, for sharing your recent work with us. I'm really excited and look forward to learning more from you.
Sure, and I just dropped my email into the chat, just marcelo.worsley@northwest.edu. So if people have follow-up questions or things that we're unable to get to, feel free to reach out. And thank you for all these exciting questions and ideas. This is fun. I feel like, you know, academia, we have to do more of this because I think this is where a lot of the sort of the new ideas get generated. So thank you guys for inviting me.